Okay, everyone, let's get started. So thank you for joining today. My name is Molly Hatch and I'll be hosting the webinar on Speed Up Your Data Prep in Ultrix. If you have any questions throughout the session, please put them in the chat box and I will periodically stop to answer these questions. So the agenda for today's webinar is I'm going to showcase some really useful tools that are used really often in Ultrix, and I certainly use in almost all of my workflows to clean data, prep it, and analyze it so that we can gain some further insights. I'm going to go through an example, two examples, and we'll also walk through an exercise so that I can give a bit of background of how these tools can be configured and help you with your data prep. So the first thing that we're going to do, just quickly, is I've also shared some of the files on this bit.ly link if you want to follow along while I explain. And they should be found in that link. So let's get started. The first thing I'm going to show you is the first data set that we'll be going through today. This is based around a gift shop, their sales. So we can see different fields here, the order date, the category, the products that we're selling, the price and the units, and also the location. So we can see initially that the data looks quite clean, but there are some issues here that we may want to clean in Ultrix. And what we want to get to with this data set is we want to be able to understand which products have generated the largest number of sales. So just to give you a look at our output that we want to achieve, this is it. So we want to see which product has sold the most. So let's now bring this into Alteryx. Just going to shut these. So open up your Ultrix designer. We can see the interface here. So before I start going through this first demonstration, I'm just going to talk through some really useful parts about the Ultrix interface itself. So the first thing is this toolbar at the top, which is where we drag and drop our tools from. All our tools are categorized into different categories depending on their functions. And these can be easily identified because we can see the color is different and also the shape of the tool. So here we can see all the data prep tools are blue and circular. All the join tools are purple and square. And this makes it really useful when we're creating a workflow to understand the general steps that we've made. Another really useful part of the toolbar is that we can click on a tool and get a really quick overview about what this tool does. A little snapshot of the functions that it can provide us. We can also, let me zoom out, open up an example. So Alteryx, clicking on this function will open up into a new workflow, this here, and this gives us the different ways the tool can be configured and its output. So this is a really useful tool that you can use to see whether the tool that you've selected is the right tool for your functionality. Another really powerful part of the toolbar is this search function at the top here. So we can very easily search a tool or search a function that we want to do. So for example, if we want to remove punctuation, we can type that straight in here and we can see that Ultrix has suggested using the data cleansing tool, and we can drag this tool straight into our canvas. And that's a really powerful function there. So the next part I'm going to explain is this canvas. So this white space here is where we drag and drop tools to create a workflow. Now let me start with this gift shop data. The first thing that we want to do is input the data. So let's drag and drop this input data tool into our canvas. And now we can see that this configuration window on the left-hand side has changed. Now this part of Ultrix is where we configure each tool, and the way it looks will change depending on the tool that we've brought into the canvas because each tool has a different function. So let's go ahead and connect to our gift shop database. So if we click on this drop down here, connect to a file or database, we're prompted to pick one of these 5 options. Now these 5 options are quite self-explanatory. I won't go through them, but for this sake, we want to click on Files. So let's click Select File and bring in our gift shop data, as you can see here. Let's open that. And now we can see our configuration window has changed. So we want to, this is how we can configure our tool in order to generate the correct output. So this first part of the input tool will give us some information about our file initially and some options that we can make before we even bring in the data. It also tells us what file type we have, and we can see here that this is a CSV file. Now this will become really important later, but I'll get back to it. The next part of the configuration window is this preview, and this will give us an insight into what data we're going to bring into Ultrix. And now this looks like very similar to the data that we were just looking at. So let's now bring this data in. We can do that by clicking this Run button on the right-hand side. Let's click Run, and we can see by clicking on this output anchor that our data has been brought into Alteryx. Now we can see all of our data in this results pane at the bottom. We can see that we have 8 fields and 18 records, and this is correct. This results window will change depending on the functions that we apply to our data. So the input and the output anchors that we see on a tool will indicate what changes that we've made. Another really important part of this results window is the metadata option just here. So if we click that, we get another view. And this is the data about our data. So it tells us the name of our fields, the different data types, the size and the source. Now what's really interesting here is that all of our fields are strings. And this is because we've brought in a CSV file that we can see here. All CSV files will bring in all fields as string values. So almost always one of the first steps that you want to do with a CSV file is correct your data types. Now data types in Ultrix are really important because a lot of the functionality in the tools is dependent on the data type that your field is. I'll get back to that a bit later on. But the first thing that we want to do approaching this data set is to ensure that we have corrected these data types. So let's flick back to data and bring in our second tool. And this will be the select tool. So if we go up to the preparation tab in our toolbar and click on drag in the select tool, which looks like a tick, we drag that in and connect to the input data, we can now see again this input and output anchor. Looking at the configuration window on the left-hand side, it was very similar to our metadata option. It gives us all the fields within our data and also the data type. Now, in the metadata option, in our results window, we weren't able to change the data type, but here we are. So I'm just going to quickly run through the different data types that Ultrix accepts, and you can see them by clicking on one of the drop-downs. So the first option that it gives us is bool, which is Boolean. And this means that a value can either be one of 2 logical values. It can either be 0, false, and not 0, and true. The next options are numeric options, and that ranges from byte all the way down to double. So we have several different types. Now the byte and the integers accommodate whole numbers of different sizes. But the fixed decimal, float, and doubles are, allow for additional precision in form of decimal values. So that covers our numeric values. These next 5 options are our string data types. Now these strings are a sequence of characters such as letters, numbers, symbols, and spaces, and they can vary in length or be fixed in length. And this is what this V stands for. V strings will vary in length within one field. The next data types that we come across are the date and time data types, and there's 3 of these, either for a date, a time, or a date and time. And the final is spatial. So let's configure our fields now to the correct data types. So order date, we would presume would be a date. Category and product we can keep as strings, and same with order ID. Price, let's change that to a double. And units, let's also change that to a double. And location and order notes we can keep as strings. We can very easily see the changes we've made in this configuration because our boxes go red, which is really handy. So let's quick run now on the right-hand side to see these changes get pulled through. And now instantly we can see that we have these conversion errors. Now this is part of the results window, is these workflow messages that indicate if there have been any errors or warnings due to our tool configurations, and it's really useful. So here we can see that Ultrix is telling us that our order date, that we just made a date, is not a valid date. And this is because Ultrix recognizes dates in the form of year, month, and day. However, our order date was in the format of day, month, and year. And we can see again that this hasn't worked because if we click on the output anchor of the select tool, our order date is null. So what we need to do now, looking at our input, is firstly reconfigure this so that it's in the format of year, month, and day. And we can do that using one of the parse tools at the top, the date time tool. But we first have to change this order date back to a string here. So let's change this back to a string, and you'll see why in a minute. So let's drag in this date time tool at the top here and connect it to our select tool. We can now see this different configuration window. And the first option is that we've selected is to convert a string to a date time format. And that's why we wanted to change our data type back to a string. The next option is asking us to confirm which field that we want to convert to a date, and that's order date. And the way that this tool works is it will output our configuration into a completely new column. And this is what this aspect here is asking us. What do we want to call this column? And let's call it order date output. Moving down the configuration window now, we can see that there is a variety of different date formats here. And Ultrix is asking us, what format is your date currently in? Now looking at our select tool, looking at our select tool, we can see that our order date is in day, month, year. So let's find that in this configuration. Day, day, month, month, year, year, year. Day, day, month. There we go. Now this is correctly configured. We should run this. And now we can see that our order date column has is still here, and our new order date output column has been appended onto the right-hand side. And if we look at the metadata option here, we can see that our order date output, which is the column that we specified here, is now a date field. So looking back at this, it now could be quite confusing that we have the order date output as well as the order date. So let's remove this field. If we go into our preparation tab in our toolbar, we can drag in another select tool, and removing fields in the select tool is really easy. You simply just unselect the field and click run. And now we can see that order date, our original column, has been removed. Now, I'm thinking that I now want to remove this order notes column because it doesn't look like it's populated with anything. And if we hover over the column header, we can actually see that 38% of it is null and 61% of it is empty. Now this is easy to see because we have a fairly small data set, but if our data was hundreds of thousands of rows long, the results window will only show us a preview of our data. So sometimes it can be useful to use a certain tool in order to analyze all of our data at the same time. And we can do that using the browse tool. So if we click on in and out and click on the browse tool, we can see that this tool allows us to view data from a connected tool and also profile our data and give us further analysis. So let's drag that into this after the select tool and press run. And now we can see some really useful information. Now, this configuration window for the browse tool will change depending on the data type of the column that you've selected. So at the moment, it's showing us the category field. We can see that we have two categories here, chocolates and card. Our data quality is 100%, and it also provides us with some other really useful information. Now, this configuration, as I said, will change depending on the data type that you are looking at. So if we were to look at price, which is a numeric data set, we can already see how this has changed. And scrolling down now, we can actually get some really useful information from this, such as the minimum and the maximum price. And this can be really useful if you have lots of rows of data to get a quick snapshot of the kind of data that you're looking at. Now, if we click at this order notes column, we can see again the data quality. This column is almost all empty, but also has some nulls. So let's remove this column. It doesn't look very helpful to us. If we click back into the select tool and uncheck order notes, this should now remove it. So one also important thing to note about the browse tool is it doesn't have an output. Now you can connect this at any point of your workflow, but you can only connect it as an input. You will have to continue your workflow ignoring the browse tool. So let's do that and think about what we need to do next in our data preparation. So looking at this location column, I can see that although all the locations are London, I can see that some have full stops next to them and also some are in uppercase. Now I want to make sure that these are all the same format. And earlier I showed you this search bar and I typed in remove punctuation and it suggested us to use the data cleansing tool. So let's drag that into the workflow, connecting it to our select tool. Now the configuration of this tool asks us to first choose the fields that we want to apply our data cleaning to. And in this case, it's the location field. So let's keep that one checked. This field doesn't have any nulls, so we can uncheck those because this doesn't apply to us. And it's this part that we really want to look at. So we don't have any leading and trailing white spaces, but what we wanted to do was to remove punctuation. So let's check that. We also had the issue that some of our London was in uppercase, and for data prep sense, I would prefer for them all to be the same case, so to be title case, and we can do that in the bottom of this configuration. If we now run this, we can now see how our location column is now looking all the same, which is really great. Now looking at this, I would now say that all of our data prep we finished, but maybe we want to get some further insights from this. I mentioned we want to know what our top selling products are. Now I can see from our data that we have price in units. So let's calculate the sales for each order ID. And we can do that using the formula tool. So let's go into the preparation tab, drag in the formula tool, and let's now configure this. And this is a really powerful tool. So the first option that it asks us to select is the output column. Do we want to output this calculation as a new column, or do we want to change the values in an existing column? For this example, we want to add a new column and we want to call it sales. So the next aspect of this configuration is to write our calculation. And there is this blue button at the top here called functions. That's really helpful when if you're not sure the type of structure that you need to write a correct calculation. It'll give you loads of different options that you can use, and hovering over gives you how you use it. So for example, this length string will return the length of a string. And you can also see that these are categorized into different data types. So it's really important that you get that correct early on in your workflow. But for this example, I merely want to do I want to do price times units. And clicking on this next blue button, we can see our existing columns. So let's click on price, type in a times button, and we can actually just type in units. And in this data preview, we can see that this calculation is valid because we have a valid number in here. just for example's sake, if I was to type in product, which is a string, it's now telling us that our formula doesn't work because we can't multiply by a string. So this can be really useful to troubleshoot your calculations if you don't want to keep running your workflow. So let's change this back to units and change the data type of our new column as a double. Now running this, we can now see that we have a new sales column on the right hand side here. Now we wanted to know which products have generated the largest sales to date. So our output looked like 4 rows of data where each row was one of our products. And we can see we have 4 products here. So we want to ultimately look at all our selection boxes, our large ones, and add up their sales. And we then want to add up our small selection boxes and add up their sales. And we can do that using the Summarize tool in the transform part of our toolbar. Let's drag that in next to our formula and configure this. Now the first part of this configuration is showing us all the fields in our data and also their data type. And the way that this tool works is it will ask you to pick a field and we'll add an action to it using this add button here. Now the actions that can be applied to a tool is dependent on the data type of that field. So for this case, we want to know the total sales for each product. So let's group by product and sum our sales. So this is now saying for each product, give me the sum of sales. And we can change the output here to total sales. Now let's run this. And now we can see this was what our output Excel file looked like. We have all 4 of our products and all 4 of our total sales. Now, if we had more products, we could sort these here, but we only have 4. So this is exactly what we wanted. And we did that using, not very many tools, but all very useful. So now, if we wanted to output this, we could use the output tool in the in and out part of our toolbar, drag that into our canvas, connecting it to the Summarize tool, and configure this. Now this is very similar to the input tool. We basically click on this drop down and select where we want to save our file. So here I'm going to say total sales per product. And it will also ask us what data type that we want to save it as. I'm going to save it as an Excel and just click save. You can also name the sheet name, and in order for the data to be dragged through the workflow and output as a file, you have to run it. So let's click run. And this file should now be in my desktop. Yes. So that's our first workflow, walking through data, simple data from our gift shop. Does anyone have any questions? Just open the chat. No? Okay, perfect. I'll move on to the next example. So the next example that we're going to look at is in a format that I know we've all seen before. It's this finance data here. I'm sure we've all seen Excels that are in this format with a very large title at the top, some nice colors, a total, rows with totals in. Now, although this may look striking visually, it can be hard to actually generate a lot of analysis from this. And it's also not easy to use in a visualization tool that we might want to visualize this data later on. So let's bring this into Ultrix and clean it up. So I'm going to create a blank workflow and start by inputting my data. And I'm going to do this in the same way that I did with my previous workflow. I'm going to click on this drop down click on Files, select a file, and click here. Select my correct sheet and bring it in. And now we can see that our data is not a CSV, but it's actually an Excel file. And looking at our preview, we can see a lot of nulls. Our column headers are actually F1, F2, and they should be department and category. So that's definitely a step that we'll have to make. But let's start by clicking Run and inputting the data into Alteryx. So first of all, let me make this results window a bit bigger so you can see. We can see that this Finance 2018 title is not really needed in this workflow. We can always name our file name Finance 2018. Ideally, what we want to do is bring up department, category, and our dates to replace these F1, F2, F3 fields. And that's the first thing we're going to do. What we'll have to do first is remove this initial null row. And looking all the way across, we can see that it's always null. So let's click on the preparation tab of our tools and click and use a sample tool. Now, the way that this tool works is it will ask us how we want to select our sample. And in this case, we just want to skip the first row. So let's click skip first row and type in 1. And this should remove our initial null column. Now let's click Run. And now we can see that we're closer to getting our column headers in the correct place. The next thing that we want to do is actually just replace department, replace F1 with department, and replace F2 with category. And we can use that, we can do that using the dynamic rename tool. So I'm going to search for it up in my search bar. And I'm going to search for dynamic rename and drag that into the view. Now, we're going to use this tool fairly simply. We can simply click on this rename mode field and click the drop down and select take field names from first row of data. And if we zoom out and run this, we can now see that our column headers are in the correct place. So looking at this data now, the next thing that I want to do is to populate these nulls with the correct department. So we know that personnel, administration, travel, and products all belong to the department category. And looking further down, we also know that personnel, events, travel, and software belong to the HR department. So what we want to do is we want to replace this null with the field above it. So that will now say finance. And we want to do that all the way down until we get to HR. And then we want to reset. We want to replace this null with HR, etc., etc. And we can do that using the Multirow formula tool in our data prep tab. So let's click and drag this onto our canvas and configure this. So the first option, this configuration, asks us whether we want to update an existing field or create a new one. Now in this case, we want to update our department field. So let's update an existing field and click department. Now let's move down to our expression. And the way that this tool works is that it will give us options where we can create expressions based on our row -1, our active row, and our row +1. And if I go back to the input anchor, this will be our active row, and we'll want to take the row -1 and make that this row, and then follow it down until we get a new department, and then we'll take, if the next row is null, we want to take the row above it, and etc., etc. It'll kind of flow down this column. So let's write this expression. So we will say, if the current row is null, and we can say here, if the current row in department is null, so for example here, if this row is null, we want to take the row above it. So we would say, then, let's collapse this, we want to take the row above it. But if it's not null, else, take the current row. So that's saying that if the current row is null, then take the row above it. However, if it's not null, for example, in this case, then just keep the same department. And that will ensure that our department resets every time we hit a new name. And we want to end this by saying end if, and that's our if statement there. Now, if we run this, and we click on the output anchor, we can now see that each row has been populated with the correct department. Now our data is looking a lot better. So the next thing that we want to do, if we remember from our Excel, is that we had these blue rows that are indicating totals, and we can identify them in our data because the category is null. Now we want to remove that because it can be a bit misleading if we don't have total written in our data anywhere. And we can always create these totals later on. So let's remove those total rows completely. And we can do that using a filter tool. And this is also in the preparation part of our toolbar. It's just here. Let's drag in the filter tool and configure this. So the way that we want to filter our data is that we want to say that if category is null, I'll show you. If our category here is null, we know that it's a total column and we want to remove it. And that's how we want to build the logic into our filter tool. So we want to say, if category is null, then we want to remove it. But I'm going to say is not null so that we get our correct output coming out of the true output anchor. And you notice here that we have two output anchors here. One from whether the condition of the filter is true. So in this case, it will be whether our row is not null, and this will be all the rows that we want to use. And the rows coming out of our false column, our false output, will be those categories that are null. So let's run that. And we can now see coming out of our true, we don't have any nulls anymore. And if we also look at our false, we can see that all four of our totals have come out of our false. Now, our data is looking really clean. However, I'm tempted to change the structure of it. Sometimes it's useful to have a single date column and then a value column. And that's the structure that I want to aim for here. I want to end up with 4 fields, one for department, one for category, one for date, and one for value. And we can do that using one of the transform tools here. If I click on transform, and now there are 2 different tools that will pivot our data for us. There is the crosstab and the transpose. And I find it easiest to understand the difference by looking at the picture. So crosstab will change rows into columns, you can see from the picture, and transpose will change columns into rows. And in this case, we want to change our columns into rows. So we'll use the transpose tool, and let's connect that to the true output anchor here. Now, the way we want to configure this tool is we want to keep our department and category column as columns like they are. So if we look at our data going in, we want to keep these 2 fields as they are, but we want to pivot all the date fields. So we'll say in the first part of this configuration, our key columns are department and category. And if we scroll down, we now say that our data columns are all of our dates. Now, if we run this, in the run button, we can now see that we have our 4 fields that we were aiming for. We have our department, we have our category, we have our date, and we have our value. Looking at the metadata, we can see that first of all, it's very confusing what these columns are because they've come out of the transpose as name and value. So I'd say our next step is to rename these so we understand what they are. So let's do that in the select tool. Let's go into the data preparation tab, find the select tool and drag that in. And if I zoom in, we'll rename this name to a date and the value as amount in pounds. And now in our previous example, I initially tried to change order date into a date using the select tool. Let's look at the structure of this date to see whether we can, whether Ultrix will recognize it as a date field already. Now we can see that it's in the format of year, month, and day. And that's exactly the format that Ultrix needs to recognize a date. So let's change the name. Let's change this name field into a date. And click run. And now we can see that our column headers have changed. But also if we look at the metadata option, we can see that date has been changed into a date data type, and that's worked successfully. So now looking at our output, we can see that our data would be ready to use in a data visualization software, for example, Tableau. But maybe we want to do a bit of analysis here in Ultrix. We can do that just like our previous example using the Summarize tool. So let's go to Transform, drag in Summarize, and let's think what we want to know. Maybe we want to know what's the total amount in each department and each category. Now, when I say in each, that generally means that we need to group by. So let's group by department and group by category, because we want to know the total amount for each department and each category. But we can notice here that when we were doing our data prep, we didn't change our amount to a numeric value. And if we try to sum this now, it will be grayed out because it's currently a string. So let's go back into our select tool and change this value to a double. Now, if we go back into our Summarize tool, we can now see that this has changed instantly to a double, and we can now sum this. Now, if we were to run this, we can see how this has changed. Now, for each department and each category, we can see the total amount, and this is going down all the way. Maybe we just want to know the total amount for each department though. We can very easily remove category from our Summarize tool, press run, and we now get the total amount for each department. Now this is our second example. It's very, uses the same logic as our first example, but I've introduced you to some more tools. Does anyone have any questions? No. So I'm going to move on now to our final section of the webinar. One of the things that I really wanted to introduce you guys to was some really helpful resources that I use online to develop my data preparation skills. And I've put the link in the bit.ly link if you want to follow along the example with me. But one of the web pages that I use a lot is the Ultrix Community Weekly Challenge. And on this weekly challenge page, there are over 200 challenges that you can try to test your data prep skills. And each challenge will have a name, a level of difficulty, and a subject. So you can go down the list, and if you're a beginner, choose a beginner option, and maybe you want to practice your data cleansing. And what's really nice about these challenges are that they're all different challenges. You can very easily download the start file and also have a look at any comments that other people have made with regards to the challenge. So we're going to go through one together now. I'm going to click on the start file and download and open it up in Ultrix. So the way that these challenges are formatted is that we normally have a challenge written at the top here. So we can see that for this challenge, we have the list of unofficial holidays provided in the input that we want to change to chronological order. And these challenges will give us an input file and the output file, which is what we're aiming to look for. So if we run this, we can see that our input file has many different events and days, but our days are not in chronological order. Now, if we look at our output file, we can see that our days are in chronological order. They start with January and they finish all the way down to December. And that's what we're aiming to create here. So let's look at our input file. The first thing that I can see is all this red. Let me zoom in. There's a lot of red. And we can see that if we hover over, this cell has trailing spaces. And is that the same for the other field? Yes, we can see that both fields have trailing spaces. And the tool that we can use to get rid of this is the data cleansing tool that we used earlier. So let's go into the preparation part of our toolbar and drag in the data cleansing tool. Dragging this in, we connect it to our input. And we can say in our configuration window that for the event and the day, we want to remove leading and trailing white spaces. Now, both of these columns don't have any nulls, so let's uncheck this and click run. And now we can see that we've removed the trailing white space from our columns. Another way that we could identify what step we needed to take there was look at this browse tool. And it will tell us in the data profiling window, if I zoom in, that this data quality is not okay, which ultimately means that we have a lot of trailing white spaces, which can cause problems further along the workflow if we were using this data. We can also see some other information, as I mentioned earlier, such as the data type, how many unique values we have, etc., etc. And we can actually see here that we don't have any nulls or blanks, which is really useful. So now let's sort our data from January through to December. Now we could use this quick sort here and either sort it in descending or ascending order. However, this has actually just sorted it in alphabetical order. We can see that A is at the top here and S is at the bottom. And if we look at our metadata option on the right-hand side here, we can see that our day is a string, which means that when we have sorted it, it sorted it in alphabetical order because of its data type. So we want to convert this field into a date, so we can sort it as a date data type. And we can do that using the date time tool that we used earlier. Now, if I go up to my pass option here and drag in a date time tool, we look through this configuration again, we can see that we want to change a string into a date time format because that's the data type our field is currently in. We want to select the right column to change. So we want to select day and we want to output it as date. Now, if we look back at our data, we need to understand what structure it's in. Now we can see that it's month written as a word and then the day, and there's no year. So let's find this configuration. Let's find this format within our configuration window. So we're looking for month, which will be written as a word, and then day. Looking down the list, I can't see that option anywhere. So we're going to have to use this custom format at the bottom. And how this aspect works is that we type in the format that our date is currently in. So in this case, it'll be month, day. And we can see that these two cells have now populated with values. The first one is showing us the format that our date is currently in as a string. And we can verify that that's correct because we have month and then day. And the next cell shows us what our output will look like. And we can see that because we don't have a year, it's given us a random year of 1400, and then the month, and then the day, which is the same as January the 2nd, which is exactly what we want. So let's run that now. And we can see that we have now an extra column called date. Now, if we look at the metadata option, we can see that in our metadata, our date field is now a data type, which means that we can sort this in chronological order. So let's go back to our data, click on this quick sort using these three buttons here, and click the correct one. And we can now see that our date and our event fields have been sorted in chronological order. If we were to scroll down here, we can see that it starts in January and goes down to February, etc., all the way down to December. And this is the output we were aiming for. So that's great. If you didn't want to use a quick sort here, there is an actual sorting tool. If I click on preparation and drag in this sort tool here, this will give us the same configuration. So we want to sort date in ascending order. If we click run, we can see the same output. And this tool actually lets us sort by many fields at one time, which can be really useful. So that's an alternative way of using the quick sort that I use in the column headers. And looking at our output, we can also see that we start with January and end with December. So I hope that has been really useful for you all. I've gone through some different use cases and examples and some different tools that you can use to clean up your data in Ultrix. I really hope that it was useful to you all. Do you have any questions? I'll just check the chat box. So a few people are asking whether I can resend the bit.ly link. Yes, I can send that now. And all recordings will also be on YouTube. So you can rewatch it and stop and start at your own pace. I will post the bit.ly link now, just 1 second. So thank you very much for listening, everyone, again. I'm going to, I'll keep the webinar active for another 5 or so minutes if you have any last questions. But thank you very much again for listening, and I do hope it was useful for you all. So thank you again.